Population has drastically changed in the past 200 years. Up until 1800, the world had less than a billion people. Lots of people were born, but few survived the first few years of life. Things like famines and epidemics would regularly reduce the population size that was attained during good times. The 1900s was called the century of demographic transition because a huge population rise mainly occurred in the last 50 years of the century, with global population increasing from 2.5 billion people to more than 6 billion people. Demographic transition comes by improvements in health and living conditions that improve child survival rates. Many years later, fertility rates will fall when people realize that they don't need to have so many children to make sure some will live past infancy and childhood. Their children have children, even though they have fewer children than their parents, and the population increases because the number of new parents is much greater than in previous generations. The global population is currently estimated to be around 7.5 billion people. In 2016, the population was at 7.4 billion people. This is a stark increase in global population. For comparison, in 1960, global population was 3 billion people. In 1974, population was at 4 billion people. In 1987, the population was at 5 billion people. By 1999, that number was at 6 billion people. An even more drastic way to look at it would be to see that in 1930, or 2 generations ago, the world population was around 2 billion people. Approximately 100 years later, the population will have increased by 4 times that amount. Current population projections believe that in 2050, there will be 9.2 to 10 billion people. The United Nations has projected several different estimates, low estimate being 7.8 billion people, medium estimate being 9.2 billion people, and the high estimate being 11.9 billion people. Population is increasing much more rapidly in less developed nations. In fact, almost half of all population growth is projected to come from 7 countries that are considered poor by developed nation standards. In order of contribution to world population growth, these 7 countries are Nigeria, India, the United Republic of Tanzania, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Niger, Uganda, and Ethiopia. This faster population growth is likely due to ingrained tradition. Namely, families in these countries usually have more children to compensate for the higher likelihoods of child mortality, along with the added benefit of more hands to help out around the house. However, with better access to health care, death rates in third world countries are falling. Today, the largest generation ever is under 25 years old. As economist Robert Casson said, virtually everything that needs doing from a population point of view needs doing anyway. With this and the rapidly increasing global population in mind, it is important for us to realize the effects of this rise in population and possible solutions.
As explained, there are several factors that contribute to understanding the increasing global population and how it's come to be. And so far, increasing global population doesn't seem to be such a good thing. As a matter of fact, there are several consequences that come with a growing population. This section of the video will be discussing why an increased global population could be a problem. Amongst scientists, economists, and demographers, there is a general consensus that a high global population should be considered a problem for several reasons. One of the fundamental reasons it poses a problem to is the availability of natural resources. The Earth only has a finite amount of natural resources for humans to use. Let's use water as an example. For 71% of the Earth is covered in water, and only 2.1% of that water is fresh water. And of the amount of fresh water we have, only 0.03% is readily available to humans through lakes and groundwater. Now, water is a pretty essential thing, and there are currently 783 million people out of the 7 billion that currently inhabit the Earth that don't have access to clean water. Now make that 7 billion, 10 billion, and imagine how many more people wouldn't have access to clean water. The same reasoning can be applied to other natural resources such as land usage for agriculture and food, and coal for electricity. With an increase in global population, the global consumption will grow. And with these increased consumption rate, there is also an increase for demand of resources like coal, cotton, corn, etc. Although one has to understand that consumption increases differently in different sections of the globe. For instance, it is predicted that 99% of the global population growth will occur in developed And within these developing nations, the resource consumption is typically low. But because it's initially low, an increase in population will raise consumption per household, although not in a way that is statistically significant. Though not immensely significant, the population and consumption will still require developing nations to heighten their use of their natural resources. And this increasement could develop into two problems regarding environmental degradation. Environmental degradation is the destruction of the environment through consumption of resources such as air, water, land, and soil. And eventually, this destruction leads to the destruction of ecosystem, habitat destruction, the extinction of wildlife, and pollution. This can occur if a large population relies on the same limited resources. For instance, imagine that there are 4 tribes living together in a subdivision of an African nation. And in these nations, water and land resources are essential to survival. In this situation, an increase in their population would cause each tribe to use a lot more water and a lot more land. Now everyone is using more of the same limited resource. And said resource doesn't have the ability to replenish itself at a rate at which it is being consumed. Therefore, these 4 tribes could end up consuming all of the available resources. If this is the case, they'd have to migrate elsewhere in order to find viable and available resources to survive on. Now, many people may question why this is a problem, people moving. It is, because consuming all resources and moving elsewhere and doing the same thing over and over again perpetuates the cycle of environmental degradation and natural resource depletion. The following problem is lifestyle resources. Lifestyle resources refers to things such as occupation, education, and house markets. With an increase in population, all of these markets could become highly competitive. But once again, there is only a limited amount of resources. Because there are not enough jobs, houses, or higher education, millions of people could go without. And because of a lack of adequate living standards or opportunities, people migrate as another option to find these things. But in this migration, the tribal nation wouldn't have the means to assimilate for an increase in population. This goes back to our first problem of environmental degradation. It could also push to a new problem of politics, foreign policies, and national security. Because of a large population and more competitive housing and job markets, it would be hard for low-skilled native workers to compete against immigrants who traveled in search of any job they were offered. This could lead to civil and social unrest as internal tensions within the nation's inhabitants heighten. Another problem that could arise from a mass people migration is that of national security. In this mass migration, which can happen legally or illegally, the government doesn't have enough vast resources to accurately screen all the people entering the country. With this, it is problematic because a national threat could enter the country within the blink of an eye. And if this were to happen, these threats could contribute to catastrophic events and an increase in crime within said nation. Overall, there are several reasons as to why overpopulation can result in problematic situations all over the globe.
Though not everyone agrees on why the Earth's population is a problem, most can agree on this simple fact. Today's population growth, if unchecked, will have massive detrimental effects for billions of people and other living creatures. Now the question is, how do we solve it? Meaning, what would it take to cap off the Earth's population at a safe level before overpopulation spreads all the way across the globe? One term that is critical for this question in population science is fertility rate. Fertility rate is the average number of kids the typical family in a certain area produces. Fertility rates combine with death rates, or how fast the citizens are dying off, to make the overall population growth rate. What many population control methods come down to is bringing the fertility rate down to replacement rate, where kids are being born at just the right rate to replace their parents in the next generation. The worldwide replacement rate is 2.3 births per family, while in developed nations it is 2.1. If an entire population starts abiding by its given replacement rate, the population will grow or shrink depending on its present fertility rate, then stabilize a generation afterward. Why is this helpful? If you know approximately the number of people in a nation, it brings great accuracy to balancing resources among citizens and monitoring other statistics. Additionally, This number is very helpful for job markets and the economy in general. Since the population is stable, there is no surplus of workers left jobless or tons of positions unfilled. However, the biggest reason of all for keeping at replacement rate is stopping population growth without sacrificing adequate care for the previous generations. If fertility rates drop below replacement values, there's suddenly an entire generation of citizens without enough people to take care of them in their old age. Which brings us to solution number 1, government-imposed family planning. One of the main proposed solutions to the population problem is having the government set limits on how many kids any family can have. In this situation, the government will give benefits or penalties to families depending on whether they keep under the child limit. The strength of this method is its built-in incentive for curbing population growth. However, several negative consequences arise, such as forced family planning, inadequate elder care, potential imbalance of the sexes, and undermining of people's human rights and values. All of these strengths and weaknesses were on full display while China's one-child policy was in use. Solution number 1 in action: China's one-child policy. Starting in 1980, the Chinese government disallowed families from having more than one child. After seeing their population explode in the first half of the century, China endured a widespread starvation known as the Great Famine, where an estimated 30 million people perished from 1958 to 1961. Some say this famine directly caused the one-child policy, since China's new agricultural system put in by Mao Zedong could not sustain the incredible amount of people living in the nation. Though this undoubtedly influenced the policy, there was also evidence that China wanted to replicate Western population science. Many scientists overseas saw overpopulation as extremely detrimental, and in an effort to replicate this cutting-edge scientific theory, China put the one-child policy into use in 1980. This lasted for 35 years, and since 2015, China has mandated a two-child policy for its citizens. By some accounts, this method did work. China is poised to have its population start decreasing in 2030, then level off at 30% lower than the peak in the following decades. Unfortunately, the societal consequences that followed show this measure was too drastic and prematurely developed for China as a whole. In the last 3 decades of the one-child policy, many of the things that could go wrong have. For one, like mentioned earlier, one child per family is an entire value below replacement rate. As the years went on, China's topsy-turvy age balance put far too much stress on single-children families, as parents would have to care for not only their child, but their aging parents and in-laws. This issue is often called the 4-2-1 problem. Another issue that has arisen in recent times is China's surplus of men. Since the policy took hold, families would sometimes abort or commit infanticide for female babies, since men were culturally desirable and they only had one chance to have someone carry the family name. As such, there are now 119 boys per 100 girls by census statistics, and a predicted 30 million Chinese men who will never find wives. Finally, millions of children growing up with no siblings has created cases of little emperor syndrome, where many members of recent Chinese generations exhibit poor social skills, feel entitled, and are risk-averse. Ultimately, in the biggest example of government-instituted population control, the short-term detriments create a tough case against the long-term benefit of lowered population. Solution number 2, education and contraception. An alternative population control method is increasing access to birth control as well as emphasizing women's education. By ensuring girls have decent education of their own bodies, plenty of job opportunities, and affordable, available contraceptive methods, fertility rates will be brought down while standards of living for families and communities rise. One of the greatest examples of how much these easy changes can transform the face of a country is the case of Mauritius. Solution number 2 in action: 1960s Mauritius. In the 1960s, local elimination of malaria, along with better health care, brought down death rates sharply while birth rates stayed constant. Mauritius quickly became one of the most densely populated countries in the world, with 600 people per square kilometer, density 1/3 higher than India and 4 times higher than China. Seeing their nation quickly filling out, Mauritius took action. Instead of just emphasizing available contraceptives or regulating birth rate entirely like China, Mauritius focused on education. They made school free in 1976, which eased the choice of families for sending their sons and daughters to school or work. Meridius saw a 60% fertility rate drop from 1965 to 1980, and a 75% decline from 1965 to 2010. Benefits included national development to a middle-income economy and ranking first in economic competitiveness among Africa's countries, all while stabilizing the population in quite a short time.
Overall, the main issues with overpopulation is that it will threaten the availability of natural resources like water, increase consumption of natural resources which leads to pollution and waste, and cause political tensions to increase over access to these natural resources. The best solution is to promote women's education while also making contraceptives more available. This allows people to make their own decisions while also bringing down the global fertility rate.